Hi, this is Easton Brown, and this is my presentation, kind of my analysis of the Abolition of Man, written by C.S. Lewis. So to start a little bit about Mr. C.S. Lewis, he was born in 1898 in Belfast, Ireland. Very smart man. He was an Oxford-educated scholar of literature and philosophy, which of course philosophy is going to come up a lot throughout this reading. He served in World War One, so as we go through these, there's a lot of ties to World War One, World War Two, and some of the moral objectivity that has to do with that. So a very important detail to note. He is most known for the Chronicles of Narnia, but also Mere Christianity and the Screwtape Letters. Again, very smart, taught at Oxford and Cambridge, and then this is kind of where this stuff comes from. He engaged in debates about morality, culture, and truth. So the historical context here. As I said, World War II ties, written and delivered as lectures in 1943 during World War II. This was delivered at a time when Europe was confronting totalitarian regimes like Nazism, fascism, and communism. These ideologies rejected traditional moral values. So as you'll see here, he ties a lot into moral objectivity and knowing good from bad, how that ties into going against things like Nazism, fascism, and communism that go against what should be objectively good things. So they go against those. Um, so he goes into a lot of that, and you can really tie it together that he's having these thoughts, and maybe they're applying to the things he's seeing in the outside world. Um, Last note, education and propaganda were powerful tools in shaping minds for better or for worse. So he believes education, like he's saying, the things that he's saying are for shaping the mind and the heart, of course, with the moral code here. But you can also see the negatives of it in places like Germany where there's the propaganda that's objectively bad. So going forward here, so why is this even a thing and why are we talking about it in 2025? So the abolition of man is both a defense of objective moral values and a warning about where their rejection leads. So that's kind of the basis, if like a one sentence summary of what the abolition of man is. So it's about objective moral values and why they're important, why we have them. And he gives a scenario about if we don't have them, here's where we'll end up. Lewis became concerned students were being trained to dismiss values like courage, honor, and beauty as simply personal opinions. And he goes through scenarios here that explains why we have these objective values and why they're important. So having things like courage and honor need to be seen as objectively good. And they can't be taught that, oh, it's a personal opinion or that's how you feel. These things need to be a code that we can all agree on. These are things that we're looking for. He believed that treating moral statements as opinions instead of truths would produce people who lacked virtue and conviction, also known as men without chest. Um, so he says it's important to have these truths that we have some ground to stand on. So when you see injustices in the world, that you have the moral code to make a stand against it because you know it's objectively bad. Or if you see something objectively good, that you have people join you in that pursuit. So going on kind of a chapter by chapter breakdown, starting with chapter one here. The chapter is called Men Without Chest, and it starts with Lewis critiquing a school textbook that includes statements like the waterfall is sublime, are not about the waterfall, but about personal feelings. And the scenario goes, this friend says waterfall is sublime, and the other friend responds and says, the waterfall is not sublime. That's how you feel about it. The waterfall is not objectively here or there. That's just your feelings and that's your reflection. Um, Lewis believes this undermines objective values. And the argument in this approach, which at this time was not uncommon, as you saw like in World War II, and the more teaching became more progressive, discredits the moral emotions that should be objectively good and true. So if you see something beautiful, it should be objectively beautiful. We can all agree that this is a beautiful thing, regardless of your opinion. It needs to be an objective truth. So the waterfall is kind of a easy example, but it talks more about kind of like those things that you can't see, like ideas and ideologies. This mindset produced people who were mentally sharp but morally weak, thus men without chests. So they might know things, they might be smart, but they don't have any moral objectivity or any ground to stand on. So, continuing chapter one, he can talk, and in chapter two, he talks a lot about the Tao. And this is a universal objective moral law across cultures. It's a natural law of moral truths. So the argument here is that everybody, regardless of culture or who you are we should all have the same moral truths like the Tao. And these include justice, honesty, compassion, and self-control, just to name a few. These are things that need to be seen as objectively good, no matter what, no matter who you are in the world or what you're doing. We need to have objective truths that we all can agree on. So why does it matter? Moral education relies on the assumption that some values are objectively true. Without it, society cannot define what's better or worse, only different. So thinking back to the historical significance here, so tying that bullet point to World War II is that we need to have things that are objectively good and objectively bad. We need to have this moral code. Because if you see things like the Holocaust, that's something that's objectively bad. And he's saying that maybe at this time, with people not having this moral code to stand on, that they're not going to act on it because they don't think this is objectively bad. That's just an opinion. He says we need to all agree that stuff like that is objectively bad, and then there are things that are, of course, objectively good. So it says at the bottom, if nothing is self-evident, nothing can be proved. Chapter 2 is titled The Way, and in this, Lewis argues that it is logically impossible to create new values once we abandon traditional ones. So say we got away from the Tao in the future, in the scenario, then we can't create something new. We can only have what was there. He believes values are either true or they are just preferences. And he argues that those in control can define morality however they like if there is not universal truth like the Tao. This kind of reminds me of the Puppet Master, and this will pop up more throughout this presentation, about how if we don't have this moral objectivity that we all can just universally agree on, then it is left in the hands of the people that are the most powerful. And then they get to tell people, these are the things that are good, these are the things that are bad. So in an effort to maybe become more free and we lose a sense of what's right and wrong and what's good and bad, we think we're becoming more free and more open-minded, we actually lose our sense of humanity, and that's what Lewis is arguing throughout this selection. He says words like good or noble lose all meaning if there are no objective standards. So if we don't think these things are good or noble, then we can't use those words anymore, if we can't all agree on what they mean. Lewis is defending human dignity grounded in a shared moral truth. Going on to chapter 3, titled The Abolition of Man, Lewis imagines a future. So there's a scenario where values are controlled through science, psychology, and propaganda. And as an educator, and even on the education field, we see the ties to AI and different kinds of news sources that maybe are trying to get their point across or persuade people instead of just relaying information. So this is very important today. Values are arbitrary and not rooted in the Tao in this scenario, and the result is the loss of true humanity if we don't have this moral objectivity. He goes on to say, the irony of power of nature, and that humans believe they are mastering nature, but in doing so we allow some people to control others through the same power. Humanity thus becomes less human, and in rejecting universal values, we risk abolishing what makes us human, so the abolition of man. So it says, at the end of this scenario, man's final conquest has proved to be the abolition of man. So he goes through this scenario and kind of outlines, we lost the Tao, the moral objectivity, now we are just puppets on a string, basically, and we are easy to be controlled. We've lost our humanity of knowing right from wrong, doing good, and acting against things that are objectively bad. So the key themes here, so I have 4 main takeaways. The biggest one, of course, for me was that we need to have moral objectivity, that some values are real, binding, and universal. So like some universal values that have some examples off to the side here, like love, truth, peace, justice. These things need to be objectively good things. Things are objectively true and good. If we go through the scenario like he said, and we lose sight of these things, then we don't have any ground to stand on. We can't define what's good, what's noble anymore, if we don't have anything that's objectively these things. So, number two is the danger of moral relativism. Lewis believed that if we abandon universal values, we don't become more free, we become easier to control. So again, the idea of the puppet master here, we don't become more free by everything being an opinion and being more fluid. We just become easier to control. So somebody or an entity could come in and tell us, these are the things that are good, and these are the things that are bad. And then we have to follow that because they have the power, if we lose that objectivity. As an educator and as going into administration, this is, of course, a big tie that he mentions, the role of education in all this. He says education should cultivate students mentally and morally in the chess. And this is something that a lot of educators, I would bet, would agree on, is that we need to teach kids right from wrong and good from bad. But we need to be intentional with things being objectively good and objectively bad. So, and of course, developing the chess, as he words it. In the scenario, and the last key theme is that human nature is at stake if we lose the Tao. So when we reject the Tao, we lose what makes us truly human. We must have morality that is universal. So relevance to today. Why are we still reading this? So, the modern ties. Current education often avoids value judgments. And as we get further and further along, you kind of see this more and more that it sounds like an opinion, so we can't really share it. But we need to have things that are good and bad. Ethics today is often seen as a personal preference. So why it matters today? It challenges us to focus on shared moral foundations, not just in school, but as a society. A reminder that progress without virtue is dangerous. So even as we're going along, we need to have these moral truths. And emphasize that a just society must have shared values. Wish it were that easy, of course. Final reflection, and this is Lewis's central message before we get to the last couple slides here. Moral education isn't an option. It is what makes us human. I think that's the biggest takeaway here, and the biggest thing that Lewis is trying to say. That moral education is an option. It makes us human. We keep our humanity by having objective moral values. He also goes on to say, banning the Tao will only make people vulnerable to impulse, power, or ideology, become easier to control. True education cultivates virtue, and most of all, the abolition of man is a call for moral clarity. At 1943, and still now, the lessons still apply. So the lasting impact. Lewis's ideas have influenced Christian thought, educational theory, and cultural criticism even to this day. It's still used in debates on ethics and the purpose of education. And a quote that stuck out, either we are rational spirit obliged forever to obey the absolute values of the Tao, or else we are mere nature to be needed and cut into new shapes. So he's saying either we have the Tao, or we are just moldable and controllable. So last, I just have some lasting quotes here that really kind of summarize what this is all about. So it says, we make men without chest and expect from them virtue and enterprise. We laugh at honor and are shocked to find traitors in our midst. That one really stuck out to me. Next, the task of the modern educator is not to cut down jungles, but to irrigate deserts. So again, it's about molding the mind mentally and morally in education. The heart never takes the place of the head, but it can and should obey it. And lastly, a dogmatic belief in objective value is necessary to the very idea of a rule, which is not tyranny, or an obedience, which is not slavery. So that's kind of my summarization and my analysis of The Abolition of Man by C.S. Lewis. Really enjoyed reading it. A lot to take away for me personally. It makes you think not just about education, but as a broader scope about what we're seeing in the world today and what Lewis saw of 1943 that applies to modern day. So thank you very much. I learned a lot. Thanks.